Welcome to the class, gentlemen. This is now Unit 8 for Supply Chain Risk Management. We can see the slides, I hope, and everything is very much here. Now I will just like to listen to me for what are the topics in this particular unit and what are the important areas you need to focus on in this particular unit. So let us begin with the topics that are there in Unit 8. Now, let me show you some of the topics that are predominantly very important here is shared risks and achieving an integrated approach that is for a network view of risk, and then identifying risk, analyzing and responding to risks, problems with integrated supply chain risk management, and then levels of supply chain risk management integration. As you know, we have earlier seen in the chapter 1, chapter unit 2, and I think it was, where you have seen how identifying, analyzing, and then responding to risk was the factors that were concerned with risk. But here in a network of view of risk, there are several types of risks to an organization, which we described as internal supply chain and external supply chain. In reality, these are not isolated, but are linked, as each member of a supply chain occupies a unique position. Risk to any single member can be transmitted and expanded to give a risk to the whole chain. So here in this topics, we'll be seeing the best way of dealing with this mutual risk is not to work in isolation, but to have all members cooperation, working together to reduce the level of risks to the whole chain. And how the whole, although this seems a sensible area, that is idea of new to the most organization, but in real progress it has been made, and how practical reasons for this ranging from the unclear responsibilities through to communication problems and others so on, with principles of integrated SCRM in organizational risk management and the need of visibility, that is lack of commitment in different aims, and then how later on in the chapter you will be seeing you can describe some general principles of integrated SCRM, such as visibility and cooperation. But the most important point is to design a resilient supply chain in the first place. So that is how this will be discussed during the next chapter or unit. We will be going through that. Now, to start with the first topic here, what we are seeing, as you can see, now it will be more on predominantly shared risks. What are shared risks, or how shared risks? Now, each member of a supply chain is vulnerable to its own risks, risks to other members of the supply chain, and from outside the chain. We classify this risk as internal to organization, and supply chain risks that are external to the organization, which are integration risk, coordination risk arising from alignment, and then external risk. So internal or organizational. As we have been seeing, the normal risk originating from within the organization, that is the operations of an organization, and inherent risk from those management decisions. Whereas a supply chain risk are, you all know it, we have seen it so many times. This occurs from lack of visibility or inadequate cooperation between members, and that is how it is done from suppliers to customers as per Chapman et al. 2002, and refers to endogenous risk which typically arise from either integration of risk from cooperation itself and include information that are like so many flow, and that is information flow and payments, liabilities, joint forecasting, planning, etc. And in coordination risk, it's arising from, when we talk about coordination, that is again alignment of operation in different organizations, including corporate issues, lead times, delivery reliability, stocks, then cycle time, etc. And then the next important area that will be external risk, that are there is that are external to the supply chain as per Chapman et al. Arise from interaction with its environment. That refers to that as exogenous. Now, internal was endogenous. Now, this is hexogenous. Please remember that. And then, which include the risk of natural disasters, legislation, cultural differences, and so on. Now, on that particularly transmitted risk that can be through chain, or a risk that has any single member has at least to some extent consequences of the whole chain. Now, for instance, if a company faces risks to its finances, which are essentially internal, it may not be able to pay its suppliers, creating broader supply chain risk. Similarly, a hurricane, how it affects an external risk to the chain, which might disrupt supplies and encourage firms to give preferential treatment to bigger customers. Us, causing other members to stockpile materials with consequent internal risks. So the clear message is that even a minor incident is one part of a chain, can escalate and has disastrous effect in other parts, or even destroy the chain's ability to deliver products to final customers. So the obvious problem is that there are so many members of a complete supply chain that even when the risks to each are small, the cumulative effect becomes significant. So moving on, then we have something coordinating the supply chain risk management as per the members, the risk management isolation, or realistically those members of the supply chain that do any risk management, the results are rarely good or even satisfactory. Now, citing it with some of the researchers like Lee 2004 and Christopher, that is again illustrate that this descriptions manager who fear that they might have difficulties getting supplies. So their inevitable reaction is to hold whatever becomes available, giving stocks that are unrelated to either supply or demand. Please be careful. Unrelated. So this is again what is coordinating supply chain for a shared risk. Now, effectively, they return to inefficient policies that increase investments in stock, risk of deterioration, obsolescence, and then warehouse facilities and finance, as well as changing supplies. using lower quality substitute materials, distorting to demand patterns, and also a host of related problems. So the best approach to supply chain risk does not, remember, does not have each member of a chain working in isolation, but has them working together in a coordinated effort to reduce the overall vulnerability of the whole chain. That is as far as shared risk. Now, when we move on to achieving an integrated approach, in integrated approach, as if you all have seen the textbook, I don't know how many have seen the textbook. An integrated, approach is something which is implies that managers recognize the benefits of an integrated approach and want to share them. But we know these are real reasons where organizations might not want to cooperate. So here, as per you can see, Stemler suggests that the basic requirements for integrations are that manager consider the first point. Consider, please remember these points, which is like important points even for an examination point of view. What are the basic requirements for an integration of risk management in a network view? Is first one is consider risk to all three flows of materials, information, and finance. Second, expand their investments beyond their organization and on to cover all of the supply chain. Third, consider not only the broad principles of strategic risk, but also the details of operational risk. Then expand risk management from a statutory reporting function into a planning function. So now for that integration, three key requirements that are needed to achieve the basic level of integration. So students, please, you have to concentrate here very well. Again, I am repeating this because these are some of the very important topics. Three key requirements needed to achieve the basic level of integration. That is, first, identifying the need of integrated supply chain risk management. So first is identifying, as we have seen earlier also. Having an incentive to actually introduce it. Then the next, creating the system that make it possible. So first is identifying the need for why we need the integration, then having an incentive to actually introduce it and creating a system that make it possible. So this is listing those integration levels, but when we talk about explaining in detail, now first point, identifying the need of integrated CRM. Now here it is, we can make a case for the principle of cooperation in a supply chain, but managers really do not have the knowledge that risk management is essential for continuing logistics. But the best approach is to use cooperation. Surprisingly, most organizations not got this far, and even those with internal risk management have generally failed to recognize the broader need for coordinated external action. So the concept of joint risk management still at an early stage of development, and most organizations work in isolation. So those managers who take a broader view of risk concentration almost exclusively on cost and prices rather than disruptions and other effects of risk. This is how you have identified the integration. Now, moving on from this, having an incentive to actually introduce it. There must be incentive for managers in the chain to cooperate and work together. And this means positive benefits to each organization rather than a nebulous feeling of communal good. You know, what it means is something which is just not limited for one person or one area, which is only for the good of those areas, which is not commanded just for a organizational view. So firms have to commit resources to any program for integrated SCRM, and they have to convince, or they have to be convinced, that their direct benefits will outweigh their costs, because till you have benefits which are more than cost, there's no point in it. A particular sensitive problem occurs when organizations has to accept more risk to reduce the exposure to risk of the whole chain. So then it has to be confident that it will be like get proportionally greater benefits and will not be harmed by its new arrangements. So this is how you can work on those particular way of having an incentive to actually introduce it. Now, I have just given you here a case study given on the information recovery in the textbook, just for your reference. You can even go and check it in the textbook. This particular case study gives you the clarity of this 3-point integration approach of achieving integration for a supply chain risk. You can just go and check this case study if you have a textbook in the time you have for this. Now the third one is creating the system that make it possible. Naturally, the third one is you will have, when you have made a first identification, then having an incentive to introduce it, then the creating the system means how coordination can only be achieved in visible supply chain where all members exchange relative information and work together to solve a mutual problem. But this needs appropriate system for sharing information. And now loosely described as e-business. But some organizations are still nervous about this, perhaps believing that the benefits are not worth an effort of building the system, or they may feel that information is commercially sensitive, or they may not want to reveal their own vulnerabilities. So we will be seeing on this approach in the next chapter, that is in chapter 9, unit 9. Chapter is, I think, 12. So in the next one. But let us continue with the other topics. Now, here, the other topic is identifying risks. The importance of identifying risk. Assuming is the problem of, in initiation or initiating an integrated SCRM can be overcome. So, how? The next stage is to move to the core activities, that is, with the team of managers from related organization, discussing the workings of supply chain, identifying common risks, and informing, an agreed list of significant risks. So, in principle, the risks affecting the whole chain are same as those affecting each member, including the usual diverse mix of physical, financial, information, organization, and other risks. But the scope of this risk is now made more complex by interaction with the chains. So, as we have seen here with the integrated approach of SCRM, how it moves on with the next level. Now, in this, the primary route for risk identification is clearly through managers examining all risks in their own organization and classifying them according to whether they are largely integrated or whether they have a broader impact on the supply chain. Remember this is how the identification is done by the managers. You can note down this and understand this very important. For example, managers might identify constraints on capacity as a risk in their own company, and then they have to consider the associated risk to other parts of the chain. If the risk is largely limited to the manager's own company, they can deal with it internally. If other companies could be seriously affected, they should deal with it jointly. So, thus, approach clearly depends on the ability of managers in each organization to consider risk or, objectively assessing, how or to assess their consequences, decide whether the risks are best dealt with externally, determine the amount of information that they are willing to share, and so on. This whole process can be particularly complicated and sensitive and break down for reasons ranging from ignorance to commercial secrecy. So here it has its own impact on the way it's affecting on ignorance or commercial secrecy. Secrecy has its own level of acceptance of such truth. Now, analyzing and responding to a network of how those integrators would be like, assuming the particular way of how those risks needs to be analyzed and responded. Now let us see a list of significant risks can be identified and agreed by all parties. Please understand this point. You must have seen in chapter unit 1, 2, and 3, I think, about analyzing, responding to risks. But here in unit 8, we are talking about a network view of risk. In this, we are talking about analyzing and responding to risk, which is on a different concept. So please, if you get those kind of questions, you have to be very careful when you are answering those questions. Read the questions carefully and then answer it. Don't get confused. So, assuming that a list of significant risks can be identified and agreed by all parties, the next level of integration or integrated SCRM is to analyze this and prioritize them. Again, we can use methods that we have already described, using probabilities and possible consequences to given prioritized list of risk. But this again becomes more difficult when more firms are involved. Now there can be basic disagreements about the likelihood of events and particularly their consequences. Disagreements might come from genuine differences of opinion, but just as likely to stem from the different or differing perspectives. You know, that's how it is. Again, there here, one firm might view a risk in a significant when the risk is unlikely to affect them directly, while other firms view the same risk as serious when it will be affected. So the contents of the risk register depends on the negotiation and agreement as well as more formal analysis. So this agreement, disagreement also now. By the end of the analysis, managers should have agreed a risk register that contains a prioritized list of risk. Means how, when, why, and which risks are very important. They should have a priority list. So a significant difference between this and the register for an individual organization is the likely number of entries in each organization. So managers will list all the risks that have a significant impact and that they can manage. So it's impossible to suggest a reasonable number here, but it may be 20 or it might be 200. But with the supply chain, difficulty of getting agreement generally forces management on the handful of most serious risks. Now, they can only really look at mitigating the most pressuring risks that are accepted by the majority of the risk management team. And then, of course, it is possible to list many more than 4 or 5 risks, but as the list gets, higher or longer, they tend to become less well supported with less agreement about the details. And then problems that happen with the integrated supply chain. Now, in this, we have perhaps labored the point with the problem that CRM is very difficult in practice, but these difficulties can be overcome and then there can be considerable benefits. The following list suggests some other specific problems that need attention. Now, this table, if you go to your textbook, I repeat, if you go to your textbook, it has the complete division of how I have made this table for you. Yeah, in this, actually, it is on page number 188. Then it shows you on a perspective view of those problems with the integrated risks. Now, excuse me. First of all, knowledge, and then you have here resources, operational incompatibility. Under knowledge, you have something which is more conveniently given as unclear responsibility, incentives, unequal benefits, and trust. Now, what it shows is what are all this and what do they represent in a particular integrated approach on resources and operational incompatibility, incentives on sharing information, unequal on resources as terminology, and then operational incompatibility with complex decisions, risk expansion, inertia on unequal benefits, and then we have the other one. So all we have here is which shows knowledge managers rarely look for risk beyond their own outcomes and suppliers. So the first hurdle is getting them to recognize the need for integrated risk management. That is the knowledge, and then some integrated SCRM is natural progression as logistic function. So what happens is, unfortunately, many organizations have not really progressed far with cooperation in supply chain as cooperative risk management and it is an entirely new concepts. So taking on with that the resources, that is communication, and how those communication have its own importance on resources. That is, in most supply chain there is fairly limited contact between members, typically limited to brief contacts between purchasing and sales departments. Integrated supply chain risk management needs much more communication in different levels, with all senior managers having a reconcile different aims and cultures at organizational level and people at operational level exchanging information so that to reduce the risks in a particular activity. So that is how the communication resource which has a problem with the particular knowledge. Now, talking about the part of operation incompatibility, that is complex decisions. Now, complex decisions, which is supply chains are long, and complex, and it is unrealistic to expect every manager throughout the chain to always make the right decision. So it is likely that something unexpected will happen somewhere, perhaps by a manager making a mistake. The consequences ripple through the chain. That is the problem. So I just explained to you about the knowledge, resource, and operational incompatibility about those particular areas. Same thing, like you can check that out in the textbook for incentives, sharing information, risk expansion, unequal benefits, terminology, inertia, trust, different working conditions in the resources, and operational incompatibility for training. So that is the problems with integrated SCRM. Now, levels of SCRM integration. This is very, very important as far your examinations are also concerned. Levels. Now, if supply chain consists of thousands of members or even a few dozen, it is clearly impossible to get them all to work together on risk management. So this combination of practical problems is probably makes integrated SCRM a theoretical concept rather than a practical concept. However, we can imagine it as an ideal that organizations should work towards the area and how this is what they should be doing or aiming for, even for making this slow progress. So what happens is a more realistic intermediate target would have a small cluster of those partners working together. Perhaps a lead organization could start working with key supplier customers to reduce local risk. Over time, this would could be repeated in other parts of the chain and the cluster formed at various points. So this might begin to merge so that over time the most members becomes involved in coordinated risk management. So the process is toward SCRM integration, one end of the spectrum, and so on. So even more integrated approach extends cooperation among the supply, including further tiers of supply chain and customers in joint discussions, eventually reaching the theoretical ideal full integrated SCRM. This view suggests 5 levels. Now, the 5 levels, as you see here, are no risk management at all, risk management by individual companies, working in isolation, joint risk management with immediate trading partners, integrated risk management along more of the supply chain, integrated along the whole chain. In most supply chains, managers work in the first two of the stages. Please remember this. Listen to this carefully. This might be a question for final also. In most supply chains, managers in the first two of the stages and largely see good risk management as a means of gaining a competitive advantage rather than contributing to the overall good of the supply chain. That is, level 5 remains a theoretical target, and it is fair to say that almost no organizations really work at level 4. So then now if you see, of course, their view assumes, or this view assumes that there is inevitable progression towards more integration with organization, sorting out their organization risk and moving to the more complex areas of the for areas of cooperation. So this is the usual approach and broadly based idea which start in isolation spot and grow over time. And there are certain analogies with TQM which started in isolated form and then expanded down supply chain when it became clear that each firm could only achieve its aim by coordinating approach. And similarly, TQM is routinely adopted throughout the chain, and some could be based on or used in SCRM integration. So there are early signs that it is happening with firms increasingly insisting that their trading partners have SCRM procedures in place. Now, the principles of integrated SCRM, another very important topic for how you take on with the SCRM integration. Please, you should read these slides carefully and understand the point so that you can write this if at all asked anywhere in your examination. The general principles of integrated supply chain risk are essentially the same as those of organizational risk. So we can summarize these as follows. And there are some of them you can write. If at all asked, you can write 5, 4, or you might be asked whatever number. You don't need to write all of them as given over here. The main aim, integrated SCR, reasonable approach. Integrated SCRM needs visibility, approach of how the integrated approach, where core activities of risk analyze response, and then result of integrated SCRM and it's not inherently vulnerable to risk and is resilient and agile enough to recover quickly and unexpected events. So that's it, gentlemen. You can go through all the slides, work out for yourself, check the case studies that I have given you in this slides. All are very clearly marked. And that's all from me here signing off. Thank you. Take care. Have a good time. I take your leave. Bye for now.